So our third guest is actually someone from a different country, and he's quite a recent contact of mine. I think we've only known each other for about 6 months or so, but someone that I'll quickly, again, respect for. He's based in Auckland in New Zealand, where he's accumulated heaps of exposure to the e-mobility space over the past decade or more. He's now considered one of New Zealand's most experienced and connected leaders in that EV space. Most recently, he worked with EVNex, which is an electric vehicle charger manufacturer from New Zealand, and also a recent challenger into the Australian market. I don't know a whole lot more about him, but I'm keen to get to know him better in today's charging session. I'm pleased to welcome Rob Speirs from Decarb Advisory. G'day, Rob.
Hey, Johan, nice to be here today.
Good to have you on. I figured maybe one of the early things we could delve into is maybe, what's the journey been like from you, say from uni or perhaps your early career days, getting into the e-mobility space? What's that journey been like?
Yeah, sure. Well, I have to confess first up that I'm a uni dropout. First up, but subsequently went back to my MBA, so I made up for it in the long run. But I've spent about 30 years in sort of corporate New Zealand in the environment, working for sort of local businesses and also some multinationals. My industry sectors have been the likes of FMCG, which is where I started, through building supplies, manufacturing, importing, and about 7 years ago, I got involved in the solar PV space, which was a little bit of a sidestep, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And that sort of brought me right through to the sort of EV charging and e-mobility. And that in itself's got a bit of a story behind it.
Mm. Brilliant, yeah. And I guess that's the thing too about the e-mobility space, is that it's a fairly new industry in general, all over the world. So having, perhaps 7 years or so in the industry is certainly a lot of experience compared to most people, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, look, my first exposure to EVs and EV charging generally was back in around about 2018, 2019. At that point, I was selling solar PV, and our parent company, which was Vector, which is one of the big electricity distributors in Auckland, they wanted to do an EV charging trial. And so I got involved in that and part of the installation and planning and deployment of that project. And that's when I first got exposed, and it sort of opened my eyes to a degree of what the possibilities were going to be, what some of the challenges within the electricity industry is going to face in the future years as we go into this electrification of everything type space, or transport specifically. So yeah, that's how I first got my taste of it. And it actually got me to a point where I went, actually, I wanted to have a piece of this pie myself. So I stepped away from the corporate at that point and started my own small business. And we were targeting New Zealand corporates, selling EV charging solutions into them for particularly their employee in-home solutions. So where they've got a company car, they're taking it home at night, they need to charge it. And that's a whole new concept for those corporates. And I landed New Zealand's largest retailer as my cornerstone customer. So that was really exciting. At that stage, I was using the EVNex product as my primary product. And the CEO came to me one day and said, hey, we need some sales resource. You've got the skill set, you've got the knowledge, you understand the product. Would you like to come on board? So we actually sold that business into EVNex, and I spent the last 4 years with them until reasonably recently, when, again, I've now stepped out on my own. So exciting journey.
Brilliant. And I can imagine that the type of technology you would have looked at in those early days in the solar PV business to the type of smart EV chargers that's available on the market today, whether it's from EVNex or others, would have changed a fair bit in that time?
Yeah, well, I think actually, interesting enough, EVNex was very much an early starter in that smart charging piece, and their whole proposition was around being smart and connected and interconnected, and onboard cellular, everything being done that's within the environment. So holistic, it's a concise piece of kit, and fundamentally that principle never changed through the period I was with them. And the next step now is really to take that and to start to move into this energy flexibility space, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's sort of evolved through. So the base technology, the concepts have certainly progressed, but the fundamentals are still in place of what that business started. And now we're seeing that right across the market.
Yeah. And obviously, taking a step back, New Zealand is clearly a leader in the EV race in general. There's been some very impressive uptake numbers in New Zealand, at least for us here in Australia. We kind of look with envy at the uptake rates that you guys are seeing. What would you attribute kind of the main drivers to that success in New Zealand?
Well, I'd thought about this for quite some time actually earlier today when you sort of gave me a list of potential topics, and fundamentally I think there's about 5 or 6 things that have ticked those boxes, and the first one was about 10 years ago. New Zealand started importing secondhand EVs out of the Japanese market, mainly Nissan Leafs, and that got quite a following, and that set the stage, I think, for EVs in general. And while the early technology of the first generation, second generation Leafs were, is first generation type stuff, it certainly set the mindset with a lot of people. We had a government that started to support the public network rollout. So, they basically said we wanted a public charger, a DC charger, every 75 kilometres across our road network. That has been achieved. We've got around about 400 chargers now across the public network, and a lot of these now going into 300 kilowatt size chargers. So they're decent chargers.
And briefly, sorry to interrupt, but briefly, having been in New Zealand just a few months ago with a client and driving an EV around, Auckland and the North Island sort of region, I can certainly attest to that there's a lot of good charging infrastructure. I didn't have any issues finding fast chargers to get around, whilst in Australia we're probably not quite there yet, but it's awesome to see.
Yeah. And I think on the tail end of that is that, New Zealand, petrol in New Zealand is actually very expensive. We've been over the $3 per litre mark for some time now. So when you start to look at the total cost of ownership of a vehicle, and even though the capital cost of an EV is still relatively high compared to an ICE vehicle, it is still, over the lifetime of the vehicle, starts to make a lot of financial sense. So people who are able to invest in that are doing so quite fast. And I think, just as a comparison here, is I live on a street of about 40 houses. I live in a middle class Auckland suburb. There's about 20 EVs on my street. So the uptake is significant in some socio groups, and that's really starting to push along.
Fantastic. And as a comparison, I live in Geelong here in Victoria, in Australia. On my street, there's probably a similar amount of households. I think we're probably at 3. I think there might be 4 EVs on the street now, which is great to see. We're getting more and more, but certainly not those numbers that you're talking about there.
And I think if we look at the New Zealand fleet in general, I had a quick look at the latest stats, and we've got 70,000 BEVs on the road now, and about another 30,000 or so of plug-in hybrids. So about a fleet of about 100,000. That makes up 2.2% of our light vehicle fleet. So it doesn't sound big numbers, but the real thing is that the November registrations of new vehicles, 23% of all new vehicles registered in November this year have been BEVs. So we're really getting that hockey stick approach starting to kick in.
And as a comparison for listeners, we're probably sitting at about 1/3 of that number here in Australia in the same period. So very, very impressive numbers.
It's exciting times. It's really fun to be part of this industry.
Yeah, it is, and it's interesting. I work with a lot of European clients, and we'll often talk about the opportunity for those clients to come to Australia and New Zealand. Some of them look at the population numbers of New Zealand and might immediately think, well, that's fine, we don't have to go there. But then I start talking about those statistics for New Zealand, and it's it's only 1/5 of the population, but when the EV uptake numbers are 3, maybe 4 times as much, you're talking about an opportunity that's almost as big as Australia itself at this moment in time.
Yeah, and look, that's come through. I have a lot of relationships with the auto brands in New Zealand, and one of the reasons that some of the auto brands have been launched in New Zealand before Australia is for exactly that reason. And and also the environment that they're coming into. And New Zealand has a very high renewables percentage at this point, and we're continually pushing towards that 90% renewables. And by 2030, probably we're going to be looking at 95% plus. And it's a great news story for those auto brands coming into the market. So that just accelerates everything we're doing.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think, I'm originally obviously from Sweden. We, we've talked about this before, but Sweden and Norway, we have this kind of rivalry, big sister, small, big sibling, small sibling kind of rivalry, where it's pretty tongue in cheek. But clearly Norway is the leading capital of the leading country in the world when it comes to EV adoption. Sweden's doing great, but not at all in comparison. Norway has a whole heap of renewable energy or very clean electricity grid. And similarly here, you guys in New Zealand have an electricity grid that's the envy of the world in terms of emissions. Whilst in Australia, we're sitting at, I think probably 3 times as high emissions intensity compared to you guys. But I guess, what do you see as some of those biggest differences when you compare Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, look, I think you touched on it earlier about the size of the market and particularly the population. Just put into perspective, the New Zealand population is the same size as Melbourne. So, we're a relatively small market. And, from that point of view, it does mean that doing business is actually easier. Being in the industry, we tend to know pretty much everybody. You go to an industry event, you pretty much know all the people there one way or the other. So in that sense, the barriers are broken down. I think the other aspect that kicks in, and that comes in with the larger market, is that the doing business generally in New Zealand is easier. There's less regulation, there's less barriers to entry generally. And on the flip side, from having been operating myself into the Australian market over the last year or so, is I find doing business in Australia more complex and more difficult, because you have bigger organisations to deal with. You have different sets of regulations which are more complex and more rigorous, I suppose, in the way they go about it. And Aussies generally doing business, you guys hold your cards a lot closer to your chest, so there's less sharing that goes on. So getting market intelligence is difficult to come by sometimes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sorry, go on.
So I think it comes back to that mindset is it's easier to do business in New Zealand. It's more complex in Australia, but fundamentally the prize in Australia is 5 or 6 times bigger. So from a Kiwi looking into the Australian market, we absolutely want to be there and want to be participating in that. From an Aussie looking back into the New Zealand market, probably not so much, but we are an important piece for all the reasons we've talked about. And in many ways, the Australasian market is one. We do share product standards. We share a whole lot of common things that go on. So stepping from one market to the other is actually quite simple.
Yeah, absolutely, and it makes sense if you're contemplating moving into one of the markets to do both of them at the same time. It makes a lot of sense, because as you say, a lot of the compliance requirements, if you fulfill it for one market, you'll more or less fulfill it for the other market. I think on your points before, I completely agree with that sort of ease of doing business is very different in the two markets. We've had clients where we've helped them both in Australia and New Zealand, and it's amazing just the openness to learn, collaborate, test stuff in New Zealand is just it's just so much better than Australia. You're right. I think here there's more tendency to not want to share as much information with parties, more secrecy. There's kind of maybe larger organizations, procurement processes that are very, very strict. And I think, maybe a little bit of protectionism in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the two markets are, from a New Zealand sort of governmental point of view, they've over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been a very open market. And in the Australian, I look across the ditch and go, okay, the Australian, there's a lot more protectionism that come into play. So I think that's a key consideration for anybody sort of looking at coming across both markets, is to understand they're not the same, but they're similar.
Totally. On your points before about how New Zealand's obviously been very much a leader in the EV space, one of the things you touched on there had to do with obviously government involvement and support. You mentioned the EV charging network being one of them. What are some of the other things that New Zealand did early on to, I guess, help support and increase the confidence for people to EV?
So firstly, there's been no road user tax of any description, and that's about to change, and I think with the scale of the fleet now getting to that sort of 100,000 mark, that it's time that, me as an EV driver, I've been driving an EV for 5 years. I haven't paid a drop of money into the maintenance of the roads because I've paid no road user tax. So we all have to pay our share, and I think it's time that that occurred, and that works out to be around about 7 cents a kilometre. So it's not a huge amount, but it's there and it needs to be recognised. So that's been a great incentive to drive an EV. The other key one is over the last couple of years we've had the clean car discount, which is basically a rebate system, or a rebate or tax depending on what you're buying, because if you're buying a full BEV you'd get about $8,000 back off the ticket from the government, which has really stimulated the last 18 months or so. On the flip side of that is that if you're buying a large, I won't name the brand, but a large gas guzzling ute, you're probably going to pay a tax of around about $6,000 over and above the ticket.
So Hilux,
yeah, a Ford or something similar, and and that has certainly slowed things down. It's been quite controversial because we've got a large farming base here, and they all drive utes. So you can imagine how politically that's sat. That has come to an end as at the end of this year. So our new government that's recently arrived they campaigned on scrapping that. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think the focus needs to move on about incentivizing people to get into that. And we have actually reached this tipping point, in my opinion, is that there's no going back from EV now. As people have experienced it, they're getting the idea, the total cost of ownership is there, and saving a few $1,000 of buying it is nice, but it shouldn't be the underpinning of a whole market.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great points. One of the things that I think you and I agree very much on has to do with the role that EVs can play in terms of flexibility, in terms of their role in managing the electricity grid. Can you tell us a bit about your experience in this area and why you see it as being really important?
Yeah, so I didn't know about the term flexibility until about 2 years ago, and I've been in this game now 5 years, and I'd have to say that I was having a deep conversation with an electricity distributor, and we were talking about demand response and the smarts of EV charging. He said, "Well, you're talking about flexibility," and at the time the guy I was with and myself, we said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he introduced this concept, and that has evolved from 2 years ago to what now is a whole conversation that's going on across our electricity network, and be it from a grid operator all the way through to consumers, starting talking about energy flexibility, and that concept has really taken hold. And I actually have this sort of this little graph on my computer that I keep referring back to, and it talks about the difference between demand response and demand flexibility. And demand response, and from a New Zealand point of view, is something like a hot water ripple control, where the electricity distributors are turning off hot water at certain times of the day, and most consumers don't know it's happening. It's a very blunt tool, so all they're doing is shedding load at certain times. It's very useful for them, but it is blunt. Whereas demand flexibility it's always on, it's always happening in the background. It's shedding and shaping that, shaping and shifting that, usage, consumer usage of energy, and how they're interacting with it. And EV charging is it's a really ideal tool to do this with. And we know from a New Zealand concept is that most people plug in when they get home around about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. And New Zealand demand profile is very heavy through the evening with heating and other things. We don't use a lot of AC, so air conditioning is not a big consideration for us, but heating is. So our primary use of energy is peaking through that 6, 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, and then after that it goes right down. So for us to be able to move EV charging, of the typical charge for a residential homeowner is around about 2 hours in New Zealand. So they're plugging in regularly and they're charging small snacking amounts. If we can move that load into 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. when cost of electricity is low, carbon is the renewable mix is high, carbon use is low. It's ideal for our environment. And I know that in Australia you have a slightly different demand curve, where the solar peak day midday solar peak is coming through, and you need to do solar soak. We don't have solar penetration like Australia. We only have 1 or 2% of residential homes with solar on the rooftop, whereas I think you're sitting up around about that 30%, if I'm correct. So different dynamics in different markets, but the fundamentals are still the same around the technology.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And I think what we're seeing, yeah, on the flip side here, instead of seeing a lot of EV charging being, I guess, flexed up or down, you instead see a lot of solar generation or solar
Yeah,
exports into the grid being
yeah,
flexed up and down across the
totally,
country.
totally.
But you're right,
And
I think that principle is exactly the same. It's about managing the amount of electrons flowing, right?
yeah.
And then doing that without impacting the consumer in the end.
Yeah, and look, just as an example, real life example for my own behaviours is that, some of the technology is now starting to expose, right through to the sort of mobile app level, the carbon and generation mix that's coming through. And I always thought, I always schedule my charging from 10 p.m. because that's when my cheapest rates kicked in. And I went, yep, 10 p.m. That's cool. Once I started seeing that data around the generation mix and what percentage of, coal and other fossil fuels were driving that, whether they were sort of gas peakers or whatever starting to come through in that generation mix, I suddenly realized, I said, actually, to myself, I went, I'm going to move my charging instead of 10 p.m. It's going to be 1 a.m. because I can see with that information that's now being exposed to me that as a consumer I can make a difference and get rid of the coal completely out of my driving, and that's what I've done. So
Yeah.
it made no difference to me from a cost point of view.
Mm.
And it's just a tweak.
Yep.
And it will make all the difference. And if that's then scaled,
Yep.
it's it's really significant.
Yeah, absolutely, and it then sends those right signals to the market that that demand all of a sudden is filling in where there's renewable energy supply. Fantastic.
Yeah, totally.
But by the way, what you said, you've had an EV for the last 4 or 5 years. What kind of EV do you drive?
Well, I started off with a BMW i3, which was a small little box on wheels, which was fun to drive and a new experience. And I had everybody looking at me, and I'm a reasonably big guy, and so it was a bit like, my wife describes it like a bear climbing into a suitcase. But I no longer have that. I'm now driving a Polestar 2, which is
awesome.
So which I love, and yeah, a fantastic car. So yeah, I really can't complain about that. So
Brilliant. No, they're fantastic cars to drive. I think just that driving experience of the Polestars, they've really got that down pat. I love how they've sort of built in the navigation in a really, really crisp way.
Yeah.
Just in front of you there.
And I think the other aspect of all these modern cars is this over-the-air updates that's starting to see, and I'm always quite excited. With my car, I see an update's being pushed out, so I'm always interested to know what the next tweaks are going to be and what the little improvements are. And I see that across all the brands that have connected vehicles in the market, and I think that's a critical piece of keeping the consumer engaged with what they can do. So who knows where that's going to go.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. I always chuckle when I see EVs that are still, being rolled out and don't have those facilities to be able to upgrade the cars. You would have thought that putting that extra effort into developing the EV platform from scratch, that would always entail having that option. It is, I think a car nowadays is so much more connected than they used to be, and they just bring so much more consumer benefits in the end. And even I think benefits for the manufacturer as well, right? Both in terms of being able to provide repairs or improvements, or higher customer engagement, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and look, there's the benefits of the EV there in itself, isn't it? Is that servicing and repair. Is that I've been driving that vehicle for 18 months. It has not been back for a service or a repair of any description. It's probably coming around, but the reality is they're very reliable vehicles, and maintenance costs are very low.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I can attest to that too. We are onto our third electric car, which sounds a bit crazy, but the having driven a Tesla for the last couple of years, a Model 3 and a Model Y, they are just like the Polestar. They run incredibly smoothly. They're well built. I haven't had a single issue. There's no requirements for servicing, but of course, if there is an issue, someone can come around and fix it at your house.
Yeah, I'm and I'm yet to meet somebody who has been in an EV, driving an EV, and have elected to go the other way. It just does not happen, and if it does, it's very rare. I think when people, experience the benefits and the delight of driving these vehicles, you just don't even go back. So
Yeah, totally. Talking about electric cars and flexibility, what are your thoughts on vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to load? That's always a
I've got to say,
a lot of passion.
I'm going to tell you a story
Yeah.
because in February 2023, Auckland and much of New Zealand suffered quite significant weather events. And in Auckland, we had flooding. And where I live in a rainforest in the West Auckland Ranges. And we had significant amount of slippages and incidents occur. And we ended up 4 days without water or power in our house, and basically trapped where we were because we had no road access as well. I had a nice fancy Polestar sitting in my garage, but the Polestar at this point, this particular model Polestar, doesn't come with vehicle to load. And I cursed and cursed and cursed because I had no lens. And if I had had an EV that had vehicle to load, I would have been happy. We would have had electricity. We would have run our fridge and other devices, and
maybe it's for the novice that's listening. Vehicle to load is essentially the concept of getting a power outlet to use normal appliances straight from your car, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's becoming quite a common feature now. And I think in the next little while, we will see all EVs with this capability. It'll become an expectation and not a sort of addition or an extra. So I have mentally chalked in my mind as my next EV, whatever that might be, is going to have vehicle to load at the barest minimum. So and the benefits, I know people who've had it and they go camping and they do all this fun stuff, and it's just a little application of the technology. So going back out into the wider spectrum of the next stages. So we've got vehicle to load, which is basically plugging a 3-pin plug in and drawing electricity out of the battery. And to put it in perspective for listeners, is a Pulsar 2 I think has a 72 kilowatt hour battery. That's going to run a lot of my house for probably several days. That's a lot of energy sitting in there. Whereas if we go to the next level of vehicle to home or vehicle to grid, which is when that energy is being returned into a full sort of network connected environment. Now that's where things get really exciting for flexibility, for energy flexibility, is because it means that I can actually potentially trade the energy I've got sitting on my vehicle or use it for other purposes. It could be used for grid network support. It could be used for times of energy shortages. It could be there's a whole lot of host of undefined use cases yet that are going to come about for that. It is early stage. We are starting to see the first sort of products come to market that have that. They tend to be a little bit expensive, as all new technology does. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, that will become fairly mainstream, and particularly as when that price point can be lowered, that it becomes effective and a cost-effective solution for people.
Yeah, that's right. And I think just to jive on that, I think as you said, the capex of that kind of equipment today might be around the sort of 10K mark, and there's probably only 1 or 2 solutions available in the world. Doing some trials here in Australia. I think they're hoping to get that down to at least half that price point within the next few years. And you would think that considering the type of technology that's involved in sort of that vehicle to home, vehicle to grid kind of bidirectional inverter charger, it's not too different from a hybrid inverter for a home. So and seeing that those are being produced at significant scale today, I'm quite bullish on us getting to just a few $1,000s soon. And imagine just spending a few $1,000s to then unlock the ability to plug your car that can power your home for say 2 or 3 days. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And I think what will happen is that, at this point, if you're putting solar PV on your rooftop, the generation part, some people are putting in static battery storage systems and coupled to that. Probably what we'll see is people going, actually, I'm going to not do the static battery. I'm just going to rely on my EV because it happens to sit here during a good chunk of the day. So it can actually act as the static battery. And therefore, things like the bidirectional piece becomes a lot easier, financial equation for people. So There's always going to be a requirement for some people to have static battery for whatever their sort of personal circumstances are. But I think in many cases we'll end up with solar PV on the roof with an EV attached to it that's got bidirectional charging, and that's enough of the equation for them to operate successfully.
Yeah, and the case is, that most people are at home when their car is at home too. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to suggest that the car is mostly going to be there when you are.
Yeah.
And as we get, there's obviously a lot of homes with 2 cars in their household. Let's hope that changes in the future. Let's hope that we get less cars on the road in general. But if we continue to have, dual car households, then, you have both of those assets providing hopefully that kind of service in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Now, beyond perhaps vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to load, what do you see as some of those most exciting developments in energy and e-mobility right now? Perhaps globally, whether it's in New Zealand. What's the coolest thing happening now or in the next 5 years?
Well, I find it cool. I don't know if the audience will find it too cool, but I think the fundamentally is that whole integration across the grid. So, all the way from the generators all the way up into, all down to the consumers, I should say, really. That, and people be able to participate into the electricity industry in some form. So, to date at the moment, electricity has been generated and then pushed down the poles and wires to people and they just consume it. It's been a one-way traffic effectively. Well, I can see a future. We are going to have a future of where consumers are actually become part of the equation. There's this term of consumer energy resources now, floating around that used to be distributed energy resources, which was still very much that sort of one-way directional type stuff. Whereas we start to bring the consumer into that space and go, actually, Mr. or Mrs. Jones, you can actually now do stuff with the energy you have. You could generate from your rooftop. You can sell it into the market, and we're seeing those sorts of retailer offers starting to happen in Australia really strongly. The next step is how do we bring into that EV into the ecosystem? How do we start to control hot water? How do we other devices in the house and bring those all together and aggregate them as one? And that becomes a really powerful tool. The challenge we have as a society, though, is ensure that that is shared equally across everybody, because in the moment, we all equally share in the cost of the electricity grid and the distribution, and that's one way or another is levied to us as part of our electricity bill. As people move to this more independent type space, is they're going to use less of those resources, and they're going to argue the fact is I don't need to pay so much for them. But if you are not in a position to, afford an EV or afford rooftop PV, then you're ending up with an overburden on the cost thing. So I think as a society, we've got a bit of work to do, but fundamentally the technology that's going to enable us to do this is really exciting. And I am genuinely excited about what this looks like over the next 5 to 10 years, because we're seeing a fundamental shift in the way we consume energy.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. It's super exciting future ahead. That's for sure. And I think the more consumers can, it's probably that kind of balance too. Like, how do you get some consumers to get really engaged and a part of it, and kind of that whole gamified experience that I think you and I, who are probably nerds in this space, enjoy. We kind of enjoy seeing what's the market doing in terms of price, what's generation doing in terms of emissions, and then adjusting your behavior. And I think it's a bit of that combined with how do you make it easy for consumers to see those benefits, perhaps in an automated way where it's just a part of, of just being a participant in the market.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thanks for your time today, Rob. I really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit better.
Pleasure.
Thanks for the conversation.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure we'll speak to you again in the future.
Well, I really appreciate it. And I look forward to listening to these podcasts a bit more.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob.
Great. Thank you.